This is part 3 on chapter 3 on globalization. So, continuing our section on immigrants and refugees, one of the things I wanted to point out to you is, and your book discusses this as well, is this debate between immigrant integration versus assimilation. So, one thing we'll look at here is this idea of ethnic nationalism. Remember, kind of like the bad idea, right? Sort of the my country's better than your country, more the negative side of nationalism as opposed to the more positive civic or sort of liberal nationalism that we refer to. So, for example, in France, if you click on that link in your packet here, I can show you. So, for example, this is from a couple years ago, where so you say France sees tensions rise 5 years on from Paris riots. So again, thinking about like, well, what does it mean to be French, or who are the French people? So some of the frustration, some of the problems we saw there in France were not recent immigrants. It wasn't like people that had just moved there, but it was actually people, say, that maybe were from Moroccan or Algerian, or had descendants from elsewhere, but maybe they were fourth generation, fifth generation, spoke completely fluent French, maybe didn't even speak another language, had been educated in French schools, born and raised there, all that type of stuff, but yet were somehow still considered outsiders, just from either, ethnicity or race or whatever you want to look at. So there was a huge issue with unemployment, some social tensions around that. So there were riots and that type of thing. So we'll get to a little bit later here, a little bit more on the immigration or integration and assimilation debate. But so you remember from the last chapter, we had that idea that in some ways you can think of or the debate around the assimilation in particular. We kind of had that tossed salad versus melting pot kind of idea. Like, do they become just sort of one culture, or do cultures sort of maintain their individual flair? So another term I wanted to point out to you is this idea of multiculturalism. Your book refers to this, I think. It's the preservation of different cultures or cultural identities within a unified society. So that would be a little bit more of the salad bowl concept, right? Like if you kind of are a tomato, you still sort of stay a tomato or an onion. It's a little abstract, but that's kind of the idea. So people sort of look at, which one is better, more the European, which again would be seen maybe as a little bit more of the salad bowl, or the American, which is obviously called more that we call ourselves more of a melting pot. But in reality, maybe the United States is somewhere in the middle there, or has elements of both. So obviously, we still have, say for example, Mexican restaurants or Chinese restaurants. It's not like everybody has just become sort of one mainstream culture where you can't tell one group from the other. So speaking about this multiculturalism, that's become a bigger issue in Europe. Say, for example, if I show you this article, the British Prime Minister, David Cameron, for example, has said he's argued that multiculturalism has failed because he looks at it and he says, we have encouraged different cultures to live separate lives apart from each other and the mainstream. For example, so he's basically saying, that groups don't really feel British, right? That they might move there, but then still sort of do whatever it is that they want to do, and they're not really kind of becoming part of the majority sort of, or the regular sort of British culture there, where they're kind of remain outside of that. And he says it's not really a good thing for their country. So, like a lot of things we'll see in this class, it just sort of depends on your perspective. Some would argue that multiculturalism in and of itself is not particularly a bad thing. Maybe it's just how a country goes about it. Whether or not it becomes positive or negative. Are people still welcoming, or is it more standoffish? All that can play a real role there as well. That's an important term for you to know. Continue on with this section, right? So your book also mentions this idea where, so we've talked about the first, for example, in the third world in this course, but then there's also the concept that some would call the fifth world. So those would be the immigrants, right? Maybe people that have, traveled internationally maybe once or even more than once. or those folks that have lost status through immigration. Maybe they kind of feel like maybe they're not a part of one country or the other. So we have another vocabulary term here, diaspora. So that's any group that has been dispersed outside its traditional homeland. So, for example, you might hear the term the Jewish diaspora. So that would be members of the Jewish community that would be, say, here in the United States, Europe, anywhere sort of outside the general Middle East area. Or, for example, say if you're from Kenya in East Africa, and you live here in the United States, you would be part of the Kenyan diaspora here in the U.S. So a little plug here for a friend and former classmate of mine, Anjali Saheb, from India, and she wrote a book called The Indian Diaspora in the United States, Brain Drain or Gain. So if you're not familiar with brain drain, right, that's the idea that people from poorer countries have been migrating to richer countries, right? If you're a doctor or a professor or scientist, something like that. So the idea is they've kind of been drained from poorer countries. But then another perspective is well that maybe say that they might come to a richer country initially, maybe they'll go back home at some point, or maybe they'll or go back to their country of origin at some point. Maybe they'll be able to send a lot more money home, or sometimes we think about they build up more of these sort of transnational relationships between the two countries. So that can happen as well. So just to kind of show you what her book looks like here, just from Barnes and Noble here. Again, when she looks at the diaspora here, so she argues, or she kind of looks at, does it drain or is it a gain, right? So you said, acknowledges host country policies create necessary conditions for brain drain to take place, but source countries, those that are producing the immigrants, may also benefit from outmigration of their workers and students. So again, you have stuff like remittances. How much money are they sending back home? Investments. Are they creating new businesses, new investment opportunities? All that kind of stuff. So like a lot of things, just looking at one little aspect of it might not give you the whole picture, and it really makes more sense to look at a lot of different things or look at the whole picture before we can really say whether one thing exists or not. So this is a map here. You can see female migrants as a percentage of international migrant stock. So the idea is all the immigrants in the world today is about 215 million people. 215 million people that live in a country different from which they were born, right? So say, for example, if you're born in Mexico and you currently live here in the United States, you would be part of the international migrant stock. So you can see here, it depends on the region in a lot of ways, but some places you can see are sort of more welcoming to or have more female migrants in that group than others. So perhaps unsurprisingly, the Middle East has more like 62% male, 38% female, whereas for example Europe actually has more women in their migrant stock, or Australia, Oceania region. You can see Asia is also more male heavy, but not by too much. So I just kind of wanted to show you that. This is from the World Migration, the International Organization for Migration, IOM. All right, so switching gears a little bit here, we have a couple more vocabulary terms. One would be humanitarian intervention. So I think your book just mentions this briefly, but I wanted to spend a little more time on it. So as the name sort of implies, this is intervention in one country by another country or group of countries, say for example a coalition of the willing, like maybe we had in the Iraq War, that type of thing. But the goal here is to alleviate or to sort of address some type of extreme human suffering, or to keep or restore peace. So the idea is, you might have heard countries say, we're going to intervene on humanitarian grounds. Well, that's humanitarian intervention. And the idea there is that, say somewhere where people are suffering, there's mass atrocities, murder, hunger, some sort of, it could be some kind of health or natural disaster, catastrophe even. So a couple examples here would be the former Yugoslavia, with the wars in the 1990s, but between Croatia, Serbia, some of those countries, where the United States and Western European countries got involved because they said, it was kind of almost like a return to World War II with, people in Bosnian Muslims, for example, in concentration camp like settings, that sort of stuff going on. And then more recently in the Darfur region of Sudan, kind of in northeast Africa, again, where a lot of really bad stuff has been happening there as well. The international community is so, hey, maybe we should get involved there because of what's going on. So related to humanitarian intervention, there's another term here called responsibility to protect, sometimes abbreviated as R and then the number 2 and then P. So R2P, it also refers to responsibility to protect. So this is an emerging norm or sort of idea in that international community, a set of principles. So this is the idea that sovereignty is not a right, but a responsibility. So if you're some world leader, you can't, the idea is you can't kill millions and millions of your own people and just and try to say, well, yeah, but we have sovereignty, so that means you can't get involved here, so we can do whatever we want to do. So if you remember from American politics and other courses you've had, sovereignty means the right of a country to manage its own affairs without outside interference, right? So the idea is that our president's not supposed to pick up the phone and call the president of Mexico and say, hey, you need to change your healthcare system, or you need to change your education system. We don't like what you're doing. Right? So the United States does its own thing, Mexico does its own thing, Germany, South Africa, every country is supposed to have its own sovereignty. But the idea is, that can easily be abused by an oppressive authoritarian leader, right? That they can sort of use that concept of sovereignty as kind of a cloak or almost a blanket saying, well, hey, you don't have the right to get involved in our affairs. So that, this is the responsibility to protect, you can see is kind of controversial, because the idea is, well, who says, who's supposed to determine when a country is doing something that's bad enough for other people to intervene, if that makes sense. So other countries might look at even some issues going on here in the United States and say, oh, well, the United States government is failing in its responsibility to protect, right? Basically talking about protecting the citizens, so we should get involved there, right? So again, it just sort of, you can see how some folks worry about like a slippery slope, where you might have this idea of intervention going on constantly because of this concept. So related to this, we have this is more of a legal idea, this universal jurisdiction. So you might see this related sometimes to terrorism in recent years, where the idea is that any court can claim over jurisdiction over crimes committed anywhere in the world. So Augusto Pinochet, the former leader of Chile, the really kind of skinny, long country at the tip of South America, he was actually arrested in Europe, and sentenced, and tried by a court there because of they said the war crimes that he committed while he was the leader of Chile. So again, this is a little controversial, but sometimes you've seen where people can suspected of terrorism, perhaps, and over in the Middle East, have been tried in courts here in the United States, as in Norfolk, Virginia, or New York City, something like that. So that's kind of gives you an idea of that. Or piracy, for example. The idea that pirates can be tried in any court in the world. So we see that at play as well. So another one related to legal issues is this International Criminal Court, or the ICC. So I put in here prosecuting African dictators, because that's mainly the group that this organization has gone after. So we'll go ahead and end this video here, and we'll switch over to the next one and start talking about the ICC again in the next video.